the primary goal should be trying to figure out what causes breast cancer and what can we do with the immune system to prevent it from happening at all.
Imagine a world where breast cancer deaths are a thing of the past, thanks to revolutionary vaccines designed to treat existing cancers or prevent them from making a comeback. The promise of cancer vaccines. That's what we're getting into in this episode of Tomorrow's Cure, a podcast from Mayo Clinic that brings the future of medicine to the present. I'm Kathy Wurzer. Thanks for being with us. We have a number of guests with us today. They include researchers who study cancer as well as oncologists who treat patients. Dr. Saranya Chumsri is joining us from Mayo Clinic. She's a medical oncologist and professor of oncology. Also with us from Mayo Clinic is Dr. Keith Knutson. He's a professor of immunology and professor of cancer research. Dr. Knutson's research is aimed at preventing patients with cancer from relapsing after they receive conventional cancer therapies. And finally, medical oncologist and researcher Dr. Nora Disis joins us from the University of Washington, where she's a professor of medicine. Dr. Disis is also director of the UW Medicine Cancer Vaccine Institute and a member of the Fred Hutch Cancer Center. Really a pleasure to have all of you with us. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
You know, I have found that there's usually a story behind why a researcher focuses on a specific area of study or a topic. And I want to know, what's the story behind your interest in breast cancer? I'm going to begin with Dr. Knutson.
So it's a little bit of thought and a little bit of serendipity. I actually started off training as a molecular pharmacologist at the University of Georgia and then switched gears and went to the University of British Columbia as a molecular immunologist. And I was fortunate enough, having wanted to stay in immunology, to find a position actually in Nora Disis' laboratory back in the late 1990s. And so we just had so much going on and so much interest in developing vaccines and studying, the role of the immune system in breast cancer that I couldn't leave after that. I just needed to stay in that area.
So, Dr. Disis, you helped launch Dr. Knutson's career. Good for you.
It didn't need much launching. He was already a rocket.
So, what's your story? How'd you get into breast cancer research?
Well,
is it anything personal?
It was somewhat personal. I mean, to be honest with you, I came to Seattle as an oncology fellow. And at the time, I was the only woman in the fellowship class. So when it came time to figure out what my clinical duties were going to be, I got assigned to the breast cancer clinic with a breast cancer mentor, because even at that point, most women felt more comfortable with a woman medical oncologist. And when I was in the lab, we were trying to figure out, really the major question at that time was cancer even immunogenic? Could cancer stimulate the immune system? So I would go to clinic with all kinds of blood tubes in my pocket, and I would ask my patients in the clinic if they would give me some of their blood so that I could study whether they had immunity to their cancer. And literally, I ordered tumor cell lines from a company, mashed them up, and then ran their antibodies against these tumor cell lines to see if they had antibody responses. And through that process, I realized that so many of these women were my age. They were in their 30s, early 40s, just slightly older than I was at the time. And when you hear their stories, they'd come in with very advanced stage cancer and be like, all I want to do is see my kid graduate from high school. All you needed to do was hear them, what their desires were. So simple. Desires that we take for granted. Within a month, I'm dedicating my life to trying to get rid of this disease. And that's how it all came to be.
Oh, I'm glad you made that decision. Dr. Chumsri, I'm wondering what made you want to focus your research and your clinical work on breast cancer?
I always kind of interested in immune system for quite some time, like even a while back. But then, back then there was not a whole lot of, with the immune checkpoint inhibitor, immunotherapies during my fellowship training and then my early career. And then I I was so fortunate to be able to move to Mayo Clinic like back in 2014, and that's when I found Dr. Knutson like in his lab, and I got so excited about what we can do with the cancer vaccine and also immunotherapy in breast cancer. I feel like this is kind of like the future of cancer treatment. With the using harness the immune system to fight off the cancer, and like immune system is like a living drug, right? It's like the living treatment that can change and evolve with cancer. Cancer is just so smart. It keep mutated and change over time, and then with the same treatment that we focus and target on one little thing, it's just too smart that they're gonna mutate and change and find a way to grow around it. So that's kind of really got me like so excited about the like this immunotherapy, and then collaborating with Dr. Knutson with the cancer vaccine, just making me really happy, and I love what I'm doing.
I can tell. I can tell. I can hardly wait to dive into what you all are doing. But I think we might want to take just a step and look at where we are right now when it comes to breast cancer in this country. And Dr. Knutson, I don't know if you saw the Washington University School of Medicine study out of St. Louis. The diagnosis of breast cancer has increased steadily in folks under the age of 50 over the past 20 years, and there are steeper increases in more recent years. What do you think's going on?
Well, that's really a great question. We wish we knew what caused breast cancer. Aside from a small percentage that are familial, we understand that there's a number of mutated genes that may contribute to, or that do contribute to, the risk of developing breast cancer. As to what causes all of the other breast cancers that are not related, we've been really scratching our heads and really in the laboratory working hard. We've been looking at viruses, a number of different compounds that are in the environment, the genetics of an individual, and how that may contribute to abnormalities that occur. So we just don't have an answer for why we're seeing this increase in breast cancer, particularly in young individuals. It's very alarming, obviously, but when you think about the deaths that occur, the cost of healthcare, the cost of grant funding, the costs of the loss of life and productivity. You're talking hundreds of billions of dollars per year just in the U.S. alone that we spend on breast cancer, and I think that the primary goal should be trying to figure out what causes it and trying to figure out ways that we can protect. And one of the things that we've been thinking about, and what Nora and Sarah have been thinking about too, is what can we do with the immune system to protect against the development of breast cancer, to prevent it from happening at all. Because once it happens, then the challenges start to occur, at least in some patients with other health problems.
I am so honored, Dr. Disis, that you're with us, because I was doing some reading on your background. And about 20 years ago, you had this groundbreaking idea that it's possible to harness the immune system to identify and treat cancer. What led you to that light bulb moment?
Well, I think 20 years ago, we already knew some cancers were immunogenic, like melanoma, kidney cancer. But the thinking of the field was those were the only cancers that stimulated the immune response, and they were very unique in being able to do that. Um, we now know that these are the types of cancers that have lots of mutations. They're more aggressive cancers, that those mutations that accumulate in those cancers can actually stimulate the immune system because those mutations are seen as foreign by the immune system. In diseases like breast cancer, most colon cancers, prostate cancer, these are not highly mutated tumors, but they do stimulate the immune system. It just took looking at it in a slightly different way. So, for example, instead of trying to detect the most important immune cells, T cells, directed against the tumor, I started looking at antibodies, and patients had lots of antibodies directed against different antigens in the tumors. Unfortunately, antibodies don't generate the type of killer T cell response we need to eradicate a tumor or kill the tumor. But it was a good beacon to let us know that it is possible for these low mutation tumors to stimulate the immune system.
Would you mind giving a layman's definition of immunogenic?
Yeah, immunogenic means the ability to stimulate the immune system. So, an immunogenic protein in cancer has the potential to turn on the immune system. When you develop a vaccine, you have to immunize against something. There has to be a target that you're directing your immune response to, and that target is those immunogenic proteins.
Dr. Chumsri, you have been quoted as saying that you think the future of cancer treatment is immunotherapy. Can you expound on that a little bit?
As I mentioned earlier, cancer is really smart. At some point, when you targeted them with, certain, treatment that target certain pathway of the cancer cell, it's going to eventually figure out and mutate and find a way to grow around it. And we've seen that with multiple types of targeted therapy. And on the other hand, immune system, like what Dr. Disis was mentioning, like once you activate these T cells or like B cells antibody response, these T cells, basically it's like a living drug that stay in your body, right? And then it can also has the ability to evolve with the cancer too. But I think the tricky part is trying to activate our immune system to be able to recognize that particular cancer. It's different in different type of cancer, like Dr. Disis was mentioning. I think in breast cancer might be a little bit difficult for the immune system to, generate the effective immune response. But I think that's what we all try to work for.
So vaccines are a type of immunotherapy, right? So let's talk about some of these vaccines for breast cancer that you're all working on. Dr. Knutson, I know you're in trials for a vaccine that focuses on 3 kinds of breast cancer. So remind us what those subtypes are, because I think that might be nice to run those down for listeners.
Yeah, so we have a variety of different clinical trials that cover different subtypes of breast cancer. We think about 3 kinds of breast cancer. We think about estrogen receptor positive or hormone receptor positive breast cancer, which is about 70% or so of breast cancers that are diagnosed. And then the remaining fraction of breast cancers are kind of split into what we call either HER2 positive or triple negative breast cancer. And we have vaccine trials that are ongoing now targeting triple negative breast cancer, as well as HER2 positive breast cancer as well. And we hope to, and something that's been lacking, and this is due to really the difficulty of being able to test this in the clinic, is trying to develop vaccines that target hormone receptor, estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, because when we think about the possibility of preventing relapse, those cancers tend to relapse 10, 15 years in the future. And so much of the work has focused on the other subtypes of breast cancer, because the relapse rate is much sooner, and something that we can comprehend on a shorter time scale than something like estrogen receptors. When I first met Nora, there wasn't a lot for HER2 positive breast cancer, and it was typically, thought to be this very aggressive, and it was aggressive, subtype of breast cancer. But the fact of the matter is, treatments have come a long way for this subtype of breast cancer, and patients, hardly ever recur. In general, from HER2 positive breast cancer. And we know the patients, we have a great idea about, or ideas about which patients are going to recur. And we're trying to, target those patients that we think have a high risk of recurrence. So there's still a few that do have that high risk, and we're trying to identify what those patients are. So a broad range of clinical trials, and using more, up-to-date information as to how to target those, so that we can show that the immune system can have an important impact on recurrence.
Listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with something that you mentioned, triple negative. I know that that is a very aggressive breast cancer. And Dr. Disis, I'm curious as to why it's so hard to treat triple negative breast cancer.
Well, in the past, it's thought that triple negative is harder to treat because the treatment isn't prolonged. So if you saw HER2 new therapy, the HER2 new positive breast cancer patients would get treated with chemotherapy and then monoclonal antibody therapy. And they would go on to continue the monoclonal antibody therapy for a year after the end their surgery. So this is called adjuvant therapy. So there was very good adjuvant therapy to mop up all the remaining breast cancer cells. The same thing for hormone receptor positive cancer. The patients may be treated with chemotherapy, but then after surgery, they end up having hormonal therapy. And that is an adjuvant therapy that, again, suppresses the recurrence of their breast cancer. But there wasn't anything like that for triple negative breast cancer. Basically, patients would be treated with either chemotherapy or surgery. And once that was over, there was nothing left to do. So that lack of adjuvant therapy to mop up those remaining cells that might have become systemic resulted in a significant number of recurrences in triple negative breast cancer. But I do have to say, the landscape of triple negative breast cancer is changing and changing dramatically. So, for example, when I first got into breast cancer research and I would go to meetings and I would talk about the immunogenicity of breast cancer, I'd have people, get up and say, "Why are you studying breast cancer? Why aren't you studying melanoma?" But yet now, in the span of one person's career, we've gone from people saying breast cancer can't even stimulate the immune system to a standard of care treatment for triple negative breast cancer is stimulating the immune system, immunotherapy. We now know that triple negative breast cancer is probably the most immunogenic type of breast cancer. So I think, much like the landscape of how survival of HER2 positive breast cancer has changed, I think we're going to be seeing some big changes for triple negative breast cancer as well.
Which would be good news, right?
Great news.
Especially for women of color. Young Black women and Latinx women are more likely than any other racial ethnic group to get triple negative. Is that right?
That's correct.
What do we know about that? Why might that be the case?
We don't really know what causes breast cancer. Whether there's some genetics that are specific to particular populations that predispose to a specific type of disease. One of the things that we know when we're seeing breast cancer earlier in younger patients is that obesity is becoming an epidemic in the United States, with almost 40% of the population being labeled as obese by 2024 this year. And we know that obesity, in fact, having a very elevated BMI in the obese range is a risk factor for developing certain types of cancers, such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, endometrial cancer. So, one of the things people are really thinking about is being a lot more aggressive about educating on diet, educating on the importance of physical activity in terms of decreasing obesity and potentially reducing a very important risk factor for some of our most common cancers.
We know that obesity kind of increased risk of breast cancer because these, you know, um, the amount of the fat cell does generate quite significant cytokine that lead to inflammation. So I think, educating that and try to reduce the incidence of obesity can potentially help prevent cancer, not just breast, but a lot of other type of cancer that associated with obesity.
Interesting. Say, I want to bring it around to vaccines for just a moment, if I could. Now, we already have two vaccines to prevent diseases associated with cancer, right? HPV for cervical cancer and the hepatitis B vaccine for liver cancer. And those are associated with viruses. How is the approach a little different, perhaps, with breast cancer? Are there similarities? Are there differences, Dr. Knutson?
Well, so there may be some similarities. So, for example, Nora had alluded to obesity, and there's a strong link with inflammation. So, what we think with respect to cancers that are caused by the human papilloma virus or the hepatitis B virus is that there's this long, drawn out chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is associated with the development of malignancy. And so that may be, one, place to look at for a possible cause for developing breast cancer. And then things that cause chronic inflammation can lead to the development of breast cancer. But the general thinking is that, there's probably something like, a chronic and inflammatory event that's leading to this, generation of these malignant cells in the breast. But studies have been done repeatedly throughout the years, and it's always difficult to say that we'll never, find a virus that's associated with breast cancer. I'm not sure that there ever will be.
I think when you look at HPV or HBV vaccines, they've got a big leg up, and that is they give a danger signal to the immune system. These are germs, and the immune system was developed specifically to protect us from germs. So when you put a germ into the body, the immune system brings everything to bear in taking care of getting rid of that pathogen. So when you talk about cancer, you would love to have immunogenic proteins associated with cancer give that same danger signal. Mutated proteins, they can be seen as dangerous to the immune system. When you think about a cancer growing really fast, like a growth factor receptor like HER2, it's expressed at very high levels. So it's weird enough that the immune system thinks something's not quite right here, but it's self enough that not only does the immune system not attack it, it sends a signal to try to repair the cell, fix the cell. And some of the cytokines or substances that are generated by a certain type of immune cell called an innate immune cell actually helps the cancer to grow. So, people developing vaccines, their first thought has got to be the antigen, the immunogenic protein that's going to be in the vaccine, like the COVID protein. COVID gives a great danger signal, so you don't need much to get a super great immune response. But the less and less immunogenic those proteins are, the more and more you're going to have to engineer the vaccine in other ways to give that danger signal.
Say, I'm curious, can I bring around to something you mentioned about chronic inflammation? How would you know? How would someone know if they're at risk for chronic inflammation?
Studies over the years have really, told us what causes chronic inflammation. So, for example, smoking cigarettes causes chronic inflammation in the lung, causes mutations in the lung, and that ultimately leads to the development of malignancy. And in other cancers as well, colon cancer, for example, we know that chronic inflammation leads to the development of cancer as well.
Let's say, Dr. Knutson, the vaccine you're developing, how will it be administered? Is that going to be a one and done injection? Is it boosters? Might they be needed? What are you thinking?
Well, so we have a number of different approaches that we're using. So for example, we have peptide vaccines that are administered with this danger signal so that we can alert the immune system to respond. And, those are given periodically, much like other vaccine strategies to, generate the immune response. Now, one fascinating feature about the immune system is that it has the capability of generating immune memory, and so really that's the basis for vaccination. And so some vaccines, depends on the platforms, require some boosters, and those are, just sometime in the future you will have to have a restimulation of your immune system to increase those B cells, increase those T cells. Some vaccines, there's no need to give a booster. Those are the kinds of questions that we're asking now. Or is the initial series of vaccine good enough like it is for some other diseases?
Say, because you all are involved in studies and trials. Dr. Chumsri, I'm wondering, you said that young Black women and Latinx women are more likely than other racial ethnic groups to be diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer. When we look at some of the studies around different types of breast cancers, and when it comes to clinical trials, do you think that there is sufficient racial and ethnicity diversity in some of these trials? And if not, how does that change?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of efforts coming out to try to increase patients' diversity enroll in the clinical trial. And as you alluded to, I think that's been a global problem. Like if you look at, even large randomized controlled clinical trials across the globe with multiple countries, those countries that participate in the trial end up being, mainly in the North America, Europe, and Australia. And African American patients are underrepresented, and Latino patients are underrepresented. But there are a big movement on trying to improve upon that. Increase the site that will be able to enroll more minorities into our clinical trials. But it's very quite challenging, and we're not reaching out the patient population that need us these clinical trial most.
I think there's even a more fundamental question than that. Uh, when you look at it, less than 10% of all cancer patients enroll on clinical trials. So we're talking whether you're a minority or not a minority, people don't enroll on clinical trials. Fundamentally, a clinical trial is an experiment, and it's a choice. And so, how many people are going to volunteer to be part of an experiment? And I think that this is where scientists have to do better to communicate to people and to let people know that there are layers and layers and layers of um, regulatory agencies that are ensuring the safety of those clinical trials. But I can say honestly, when you look at basic science or all the science leading up to the development of cancer vaccines, we are moving at the speed of light. And then, bam, we hit clinical trials. And it's like a freight train going off a cliff. All of a sudden, the speed of research goes down to a crawl. And that is because it's just incredibly difficult to get patients to volunteer to enroll in clinical trials. And if you enroll a patient correctly, you're telling people, I don't know if this is going to help you. This is a first in man study of a cancer vaccine. With all my experience, I can tell you, I'm pretty sure it's not going to hurt you. But when people volunteer, many want to guarantee that this is going to benefit them in some way. And we just can't give that, especially for early stage clinical studies. So if I had a magic wand, or if a genie came and said, you can have any wish about your research program, what would it be? I would say, make clinical trials go faster. And that means try to figure out a way to get more people to volunteer to be on clinical trials.
So help me out here, right? You mentioned you clip along, it's exciting, and then it's like, as you say, the freight train goes off the cliff. So what's your pitch to these women to become involved in these trials?
I would say that the pitch is, look, and it's not just to women, it's to everyone.
Sure.
We're all in this fight against cancer. And when I hear people say somewhere someone's got the cure and they're holding it back, it just makes my blood boil. Because I'm in an institution that is just crammed with people working their fingers off, trying to figure out how to end cancer. So there's an army of scientists trying to figure this out. But we need a citizen army. You need to join us in the fight, not be passive. We need volunteers to test these treatments. So be part of our team, be part of the process, and then we can get to the end of this disease quicker.
Say, this podcast's title is, of course, Tomorrow's Cure. And so I'm going to ask this final question. What do you think the next frontier is for this work?
So I think the future frontier that I really want to see is what Dr. Disis was mentioning, that too, is to prevent cancer entirely. I think in the future, if we can have some form of, cancer prevention, cancer interception, preventing cancer with a vaccine, I think that's a big thing, and I hope to see that in my lifetime.
What's incredible now, and really what the next frontier is our capabilities of interrogating human biology. It's just absolutely incredible with all of these, new, AI systems and all kinds of big data sets that we can move through. So we thought about another vaccine strategy that we have is ovarian cancer, and thinking about, how to, what we can develop and how we can develop. And so we have to, wait for data that came in slowly from humans to try to tweak our vaccine so that it would work in humans. And I think it's working pretty good, but, this is what took 15 years to try to understand, just because the technologies that we had at that time were very slow. Now we have the abilities to sequence deep, much more cost effectively and much more rapidly, both RNA and DNA. We have all kinds of different multi-parametric, to use a fancy scientific term there, strategies to really interrogate what's going on in a human, because that's really what's going to inform us when we move back into the laboratory to design. And so the biggest frontier is to be able to use all these new, computational approaches, I think, which will help uncover some terrific ideas that we can chase down and hopefully cure more cancers.
Looks like you agree with that, Dr. Disis.
I certainly do, yes. I think the next frontier for us, and something that we're actively working on, are vaccines targeting cancer risk factors like chronic inflammation. So vaccines to prevent fatty liver disease, or we're working on a vaccine we call AdVac, which is directed against obese adipocytes. So this would potentially, while people are trying to change their lifestyle, be able to reduce their risk of the development of cancer by controlling that chronic inflammation at the tissue level.
Fascinating. This discussion has been eye-opening. I thank you all for joining us, and I thank you for your work too. Thank you so very much.
It was great talking with you.
Great talking with you.
Yeah, the same. Thank you for having us.
Tomorrow's Cure is a co-production of Mayo Clinic and PRX. Our senior producer is Nancy Rosenbaum. Our theme was composed and produced by Terrence Bernardo, and the show is mixed by Tommy Bazarian. We had research and production support from David Newtown, Deborah Balthazar, and Genevieve Sponsler. Tony Carlson is our production manager, and our executive producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez. Be sure to follow Tomorrow's Cure on iHeart, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Kathy Wurzer. Thanks for listening.